Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery, where today we're going to be headed to Scotland to talk about the Glasgow ice cream wars. This is something I'd never heard of before until a number of you guys recommended that I looked into it, and I actually originally planned to include this as part of my history series, but the more I researched it, the more I realised this can definitely fall under the umbrella of a mysterious true crime. We've got the best of both worlds today, and the story isn't as fun as the title of this video might suggest. This video is sponsored by Magellan TV, who I have a long-standing sponsorship with. They're a streaming service dedicated purely to documentaries, and each month I like to make a couple of recommendations based on documentaries I think you should watch, starting with The Price of Honour. I've been getting requests to cover an honour killing case for years, and whilst it is something I'd be interested in talking about and learning about, I feel like it's a big undertaking and something I need to make sure I'm getting right. But if you do want to learn about honour killings now though, The Price of Honour is an almost 2-hour long documentary covering the case of Amina and Sarah Saeed, teenage sisters from Texas who were murdered by their father in 2008 as part of a premeditated honour killing. It covers all of the events that lead up to their sad deaths and the thought process of the father before he did what he did. But this is also a love story featuring the sacrifices that Amina made to protect the ones she loved. This documentary was truly incredible and I highly recommend giving it a watch. And then I want to talk about the fight for the black middle class, an interesting look through historical footage and personal interviews to find out exactly why it's so difficult in the USA for black people to establish a middle class standard of living. This documentary goes through all of the obstacles throughout history, like the Jim Crow laws for example, which were purposely put in place to stop black people from achieving the same success as white people, and the obstacles are still in place today. Again, this is a brilliant documentary that I would highly recommend to anyone who's interested in learning about racism and classism and wanting to do their bit to help when they can. Knowledge is power. Magellan TV have everything from true crime, science, history, nature and everything in between, with new programmes added weekly to be watched anywhere on your TV, laptop and mobile. It's compatible with Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Google Play and iOS, and loads of the programmes are available in 4K as well. If you enjoy my channel, then honestly I cannot stress enough how much you will enjoy Magellan TV. Dedicate some time to educating yourself and learning something new, and you can even give a loved one the gift of documentaries right now with the Magellan TV gift cards that they now offer. So to begin this story, I need to set the scene a little bit to 1980s Glasgow. The past couple of decades had been rather rough on Glasgow, a city which very much struggled with poverty, and it wasn't exactly a priority for Westminster to sort out. And as crime so often comes hand in hand with poverty, apparently at the time and for a long time after, Glasgow had a reputation as being the murder capital of Western Europe. Luckily, the homicide rate has drastically fallen since the 80s. But back in the mid-1900s, things were bad in Glasgow. In an effort to help, the City Council decided to fix this dilapidated Victorian tenement housing situation. People lived in the middle of the city in housing that was just falling apart around them and just simply wasn't up to standard. There was no fresh air for the children and disease was a big concern. Fixing these issues sounded like a good idea to everyone involved. Build new housing schemes on the outskirts of the city to which they could move the low-income families most in need of help. And they were pretty quick in getting these houses up and running, but they were all round just poorly built and poorly planned. And in the creation of these housing schemes, the planners forgot some pretty important things: shops and other basic facilities. The very few shops that were built ended up closing down quickly because the locals couldn't afford to buy things to keep the shops afloat, and then they became subject to vandalism. These low income families, I'm sure many without cars or the ability to afford much use of public transport, were just shoved into the outskirts of the city and left to fend for themselves. They now had to pay extra money that they never even had in the first place just to nip to the shop and grab milk and bread if they needed to. So in response came the entrepreneurs trying to earn a bit more money, people buying and selling goods for a profit. But soon, one version of this buying and selling came out on top in the form of ice cream vans, which were already an established business in Glasgow. There were plenty of ice cream vans already, and they had the facilities to keep items cold when needed, and everyone knows the sound of an ice cream van. In these housing schemes, that jingle came to not only mean that you could send your kids out for ice cream, but you could also pop to the van to get your loo roll or cigarettes or milk for the morning. It became an extremely lucrative business for ice cream van drivers. They would go into the city, buy goods, and then sell them on at a small profit. But then the argument started, and actually I suppose argument is putting it quite lightly. Each ice cream business started to become very territorial. Each person had their corner, and they did not take lightly to other people encroaching on their turf. As you would expect, plenty of new people attempted to break into the ice cream business on the back of this, and for many already established ice cream businesses, that was just not on. You could make a profit of up to £200 a week if your business was successful, and people weren't willing to sacrifice that amount of money. And then the gangs came in and intensified an already intense situation tenfold. The ice cream vans went from selling necessities like bread, milk and loo roll to also being somewhere that you could buy cigarettes, drugs, even firearms if you so wished. The trucks were all completely unregulated, and so it was good business for the gangs. But as you can imagine, this turf protection escalated rapidly. New people were trying to get in on this ice cream truck business, especially if you were a rival gang trying to sell them more illegal items. These ice cream vans would find their windows smashed, their tyres slashed from rival sellers in an attempt to get them off the road. The drivers would even get beaten up and threats would be made on their lives. Medium.com wrote in their article entitled Ice Cream Wars from February 2017. A new van could make a quick buck taking over some new territory, but at what cost? A new windshield and tyres every time. It was described by the Glasgow Herald in 1979 as mafia-style warfare. And it sounds funny when you hear the subject of the Glasgow ice cream wars, but it really wasn't funny. This was serious crime and people were scared. People were getting seriously hurt. Ice cream van gangs would walk around heavily armed, ready to defend their territory at a second's notice. And they did. Soon, what started out as something designed to make the business owners a quick buck and make their lives easier for the residents of the schemes turned very, very bad due to all of the gang activity. The regular person, a mum wanting to get some milk for her kids, would now be scared to go to the vans because who knew what could happen while she was there. And the ice cream van drivers who were innocent, who were just wanting to sell milk, became subject to violence that they never did anything to deserve. The police, of course, were paying attention to what was going on, and they assigned a squad called the Serious Crime Squad to deal with it, only there was very little they could actually do. The gang affiliations were so tight in this area, and the fear of angering a gang member was so high that very few people were willing to talk and share what they knew. In fact, the Serious Crime Squad did such a bad job putting an end to this that they soon earned the nickname the Serious Chime Squad. I can imagine the police were pretty embarrassed by this. They knew what was going on, but they could never put an end to it. After years of this ice cream van turf-related violence, somebody did actually end up paying with their life, alongside several members of their family. 18-year-old Andrew Doyle, who is known by the nickname Fat Boy to most, was an ice cream van driver for the Marchetti firm. Apparently he would drive the van around whilst a schoolgirl sold the products in the back. Andrew was described as a heavy-set but friendly kid, the perfect kind of driver in this area. His large figure would likely have intimidated people into not trying to attack him, but he was a lovely boy apparently, very, very likeable. The Marchetti brothers have been running ice cream vans in the city for over 20 years. They were an established, respected business, and Andrew liked his job for them despite the dangers of it. He was legit, he just sold ice cream and necessities, swearing to friends that he would never give in to pressure to sell drugs, nor would he ever relinquish his standard route the Marchettis had driven for decades. And there was plenty of pressure. One local gang was being relentless in their efforts to get him to sell their drugs, and Andrew just wouldn't. He was 18, he easily could have given in to this pressure, but Andrew had morals and he stood by them, even when on one occasion an unknown assailant shot at him through the windscreen of the van. Luckily they missed and Andrew was unharmed, and he was unfazed, just continuing on his route every day as normal. But Andrew was setting a dangerous precedent by doing so. The gang leaders didn't want that sentiment to spread amongst the other drivers, so Andrew had to be silenced. On April 16th, 1984, Andrew Doyle was murdered in his own home in an arson attack. Whether this was actually supposed to end in so much death or if it was just intended to be a frightener is still not entirely clear. It was 2 a.m. when the front door of the Doyle family's flat on Bank End Street was doused in petrol and set alight. One source, an article from the Scottish Daily Record from 1996, even noted that petrol was sprinkled over car tyres in the storeroom next to the flat as well. To my mind, there's no doubt that the intention of this was murder. Whoever did this would have known that the people inside would probably not survive. Because of course, it wasn't just Andrew Doyle inside this flat. His whole family was there the night before they'd been celebrating the birth of their first granddaughter. Lillian and James Doyle were Andrew's parents, along with children Christine, James, Andrew obviously, Danny and Anthony, along with Lillian's 18-month-old son, Mark. They all went to bed very happy that night before thick black smoke filled the flat just after 2 a.m. Lillian, who luckily survived, remembers waking up to the sound of Christine screaming. James Sr. jumped out of bed thinking there was something wrong with little Mark, but Lillian soon realised that the door to the bedroom was just a wall of flames. Neighbours called the fire department, who arrived and got out who they could. Lillian was saved alongside her son Danny, who suffered with only mild smoke inhalation. Andrew was also saved from the flat. He was led out by firefighters, but sadly he later died in hospital from smoke inhalation. And everyone else also died. 53-year-old James Sr., 23-year-old James Jr., 15-year-old Anthony, 25-year-old Christine, and her 18-month-old son Mark. Their bodies were found with Christine huddling over the body of Mark, a mother's attempt to protect her child. The story of what happened to the Doyles sent shockwaves across Scotland. People knew of how bad things were on the outskirts of Glasgow, but I don't think anyone ever expected things to get quite this bad. These people were completely innocent. Some of the victims were children, babies. They hadn't asked to get involved in this. Scotland was furious and public outrage pushed the police to act. This had to end, but at what cost? Over the coming weeks, the police focused their energy into finding the murderers of the Doyle family, but they came across the same brick walls they always had done. People in the gangs weren't willing to talk. The gang loyalty was so strong that they probably knew they were never going to be able to get anywhere with this investigation. But the police had all of Scotland watching them. There had to be some arrests, and soon. 50 officers were seconded to this area of Glasgow to help, and they took over 4,000 statements from people, but nothing was of any use. So they went to a man called William Love, who was already in jail at the time on an armed robbery charge. He had only been in there for a few weeks. Allegedly, he told investigators that he had a lead on the fire. He said that he'd been in a local bar called Netherfield when he overheard a conversation in which a man called Thomas Campbell said that he was plotting to set fire to the Doyles' front door as a frightener. 31-year-old Thomas Campbell, who was known in the area as TC, was apparently regarded by the police as one of the most vicious criminals in Glasgow at the time. I'm sure investigators would have seen it as killing two birds with one stone if they could get him for the Doyle murders. He was definitely a criminal and heavily involved in gang activity. He was not a good guy. But was he guilty of murdering 6 innocent people? According to the Scottish Daily Record, he told one journalist, "I will knock hell out of fellas like myself, but I don't pick on innocent people." And also implicated by Love in his statement was Joseph Steele, just 22 years old. Steele came from a family of gang members. His father Andrew was reportedly a major player in Glasgow gangland in the 50s and 60s, and he was linked to the London scene as well, even having connections with the infamous Cray twins. It was well known in the area that you were not to mess with the Steeles. Again, it was well known that Joe was involved in gang activity, but the question was whether he was guilty of murder. The implications of Thomas and Joe being involved in the murders were only furthered when another man called Joseph Granger also came forward volunteering very similar information. He said that he was even with Thomas on the night of the fire and he'd been involved in the crime himself. Granger had a lengthy criminal record himself as well. It was a surprise to everyone when within just 5 weeks of the fire, investigators had managed to arrest 6 people in relation to this case. Thomas Campbell, Joseph Steele, Thomas Gray, Thomas Lafferty, George Reed and John Campbell. Thomas Campbell would later report being woke up in the middle of the night by police turning up at his home, which they swiftly raided. In the house, they found a briefcase which allegedly contained a map on which Bank End Street, where the Doyles had lived, was marked with a circle with a cross inside of it, exactly at the spot where the Doyle house was. Which all round to me seems a little bit strange. If Campbell was the one to commit this crime, why would he feel the need to circle it on a map? He knew Glasgow very well, the Doyles lived in flats, he would have had to have known the exact flat number. A map kind of would have been a bit redundant, but I don't know if I'm overthinking that. Upon finding this vital piece of evidence, Campbell was swiftly arrested. The same happened to Joseph Steele, minus the discovery of this incriminating map. He was also arrested. On their way to the police station, both of them made similar statements which would later be used against them in the trial. After the arrest was made, Campbell allegedly admitted to the fire, saying, "I only wanted the van window shot up. The fire at Fat Boys was only meant to be a frightener that went too far." The arresting officer, Detective Inspector William McCafferty, noted this statement down in his notebook at the time, but didn't tell anyone else what was said until the next day. The other officers at the scene would later attest to this statement word for word. While Steele was reported as saying, "I'm not the one that lit the match," something he reportedly said as he was in the back of the police car on the way to the station. All officers would report this in their notebooks and would later deny that they discussed the remarks that were made in the car. But from then on, both Campbell and Steele would protest their innocence, refusing to budge in their statements. As you've probably guessed by this point, this video is going to be focusing on whether or not these men really did commit the crimes with which they are accused, or if the police were just desperate to solve it and use them as scapegoats. There's no denying these men were criminals. They were probably guilty of any number of crimes in their time. But did they commit this one, setting the fire that killed 6 innocent people? I think this might incite some interesting discussion in the comments of this video. As I said, in total 6 people were arrested in relation to this fire. Thomas Campbell, Joseph Steele, Thomas Lafferty, George Reed and John Campbell. The latter 4 were tried and convicted for offences relating to this vendetta, but Campbell and Steele were the only 2 tried for the actual murders. Their trial finally began 6 months after the fire and lasted for 27 days. The entire case against Campbell and Steele at trial rested on just a few pieces of very questionable evidence. First, there was a map found in Campbell's house on which the Doyle house was circled. Alone, this isn't really actual evidence of anything. It may have been circled for a completely different reason. Maybe he was keeping an eye on Doyle but didn't actually commit the crime. But Campbell denied knowing of this map's existence entirely, saying the police actually planted it in his briefcase, which I suppose can't be proved either way. Secondly, there was the statements that both Campbell and Steele allegedly made after their arrests. It seems very strange to me that both these men, who are pretty experienced criminals, probably knew how arrests worked. Why would they incriminate themselves with such blatant statements? The only people who could back up these statements being made were all police officers, who all wrote very similar, if not identical, things in their notebooks. There's no way to know or not if these statements were genuinely made or if there was any collusion here between the police. Campbell's partner, who was present at his arrest, insists that he did not say what the officers accused him of saying. And the fact that almost every officer present at the scene was able to recall these statements almost perfectly would actually prove to be a problem. The majority of them said that they wrote the statements in their notebooks sometime after the fact, sometime after the statement was made, but yet they were almost word for word identical, and psychologically proven that's not really what would happen. A study was actually done in the aftermath of this case to have a look at how well these officers should have been able to remember the statements made if they're writing these statements in their notebooks hours or even days after the fact. You'd kind of expect them to get the general gist of it correct, but not word for word. You definitely wouldn't remember word for word. Especially Campbell's statement, which was a lot longer than Joseph Steele's. And next, there was actually a piece of evidence against Steele in the form of a man called William Ferguson, who said he overheard a conversation in the barred pub between Steele and someone else, in which Steele said he got an easy £300 for torching a cellar. But this piece of evidence was questionable from the beginning. Ferguson was in very poor health and he could never quite get his story straight. It changed all of the time. And then finally, there was the aforementioned statements made by both William Love and Joseph Granger. Love said that in March 1984, he overheard a conversation between Campbell, Steele, Gray, Granger, and a man called Duncan Moore. Love said that Campbell and Gray spoke about setting fire to Fatboy's door to give him a fright, to which Steele was listening and responded, "Aye," in agreement. Now, it's important to know that at the time of this statement, William Love was actually being held in jail on an armed robbery charge and was awaiting convictions on many other crimes he committed as well. But magically, after he made this statement in regards to the fire, he was set free on bail. There have long been rumours that the police gave Love a deal. Implicate Campbell in the Doyle fire and we'll let you walk. He was actually allowed free the afternoon of the day that he gave the statement to the police, and was later that year acquitted entirely of that charge. Love said that he overheard this conversation in the pub on a weekend, the 23rd or 24th of March. It wouldn't have taken much police work to realise that this was also the weekend that he committed the armed robbery that he was being charged with, on the 25th of March 1984. To try and prove his innocence in the armed robbery, he gave the police an alibi depicting his movements across that entire weekend. I think he said he was at his sister's that entire weekend. At no point in the alibi did he mention that he was in the Netherfield bar. So either he did commit the armed robbery and was lying about his alibi, or he was lying by overhearing the conversation between Campbell and the others. It's also worth noting that by his own admission, Love was the one who committed the shooting against Andrew Doyle when he was shot through the windscreen of his ice cream van. At first, he told the police it was Thomas Gray who had fired the shots and he was just there, which actually led to Gray serving 9 years of a 14-year sentence, before later admitting that it was indeed himself who'd fired the shots. So this guy is clearly a liar. The second statement this trial hung on was that of Joseph Granger, who took the stand as a key witness. He had signed a statement on the 25th of May 1984 in which he had said that he was with Campbell and Steele on the night of the fire. He knew they'd done it. Only when he finally took the stand at trial, he denied ever making that statement. He said that the police had made it up and forced him to sign it by means of bullying and violence. Nothing that was said in the statement was true. He said that he wasn't involved in any ice cream vans at the time and didn't know anything about it. But from the very start, the police said they knew Granger was involved in the murders. They interrogated him for hours on end, telling him they'd pin the murders on him if he didn't give them something, and then he'd get 30 years in prison. They threatened that his girlfriend would get done for it as well. He made accusations of the police literally beating him, kicking him whilst he laid on the ground, hitting him with the lid of a desk. In the end, he signed the statement only because they'd beaten him into it. He said that as soon as he came out of the station, he went to a lawyer and asked what he's best to do, who advised him to tell the truth at the trial, which he said he did. Police in the courtroom were absolutely stunned when Granger stood up on the stand and turned on them. He was arrested for perjury immediately upon leaving the courtroom. The police had also allegedly bullied his 19-year-old girlfriend, Lynn Chalmers, into signing a statement saying that Granger was out on the night of the fire, but she said that this wasn't true. The two of them had been home at the time after popping to the Netherfield bar for just an hour. When the prosecution's evidence in the form of this statement crumbled, all they really had to rely on was that of Love. The entire trial stood in the balance of whether the jury believed William Love. Although they did have the other evidence, they knew that that alone wasn't strong enough to get a conviction here. The jury had to believe him. So that was it. That was pretty much all of the evidence they had in this case. And despite the trial judge telling the jury that there was absolutely no evidence to tie either Steele or Campbell to the crime scene, they were found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum sentence of 20 years. The judge described them both as vicious and dangerous individuals. They were sent to Barlinnie prison where they continued to protest their innocence over the coming years. But nobody believed them. This was a very high-profile case, and the general public was still outraged at the deaths of the Doyles. Someone had to pay, and who were the public to question the verdict of the jury in this case? Campbell and Steele were to spend the next 20 years locked up. Campbell was also convicted separately for his involvement in the earlier shotgun attack on Andrew, and was sentenced to an extra 10 years for that crime. Although, as we covered, Love did later admit to this. The next 20 years would be a lengthy legal battle for Campbell and Steele as they attempted to prove their innocence. They first made appeals in 1989, 5 years after they were convicted, but they failed. And then in 1992, two journalists called Douglas Skelton and Lisa Brownlee wrote a book entitled Frightener about the case, for which they interviewed William Love. It was in these interviews that Love admitted that he'd lied under oath. He said he'd never overheard a conversation in the Netherfield bar that weekend and even signed an affidavit to that effect. He said that he'd lied at the trial at the instigation of Detective Superintendent Walker and Detective Inspector McKillop under various inducements and threats that they made. It was also during these interviews that he said he'd been the one to carry out the shooting prior to the fire. His sister also signed an affidavit to the same effect, that she knew her brother had carried out the shooting. Love said of why he did it, "I did so because it suited my own selfish purposes. The explanation as to why I gave evidence is this. The police pressured me into giving evidence against Campbell, who they clearly believed was guilty of arranging to set fire to the Doyle house." It was at this point that both Campbell and Steele intensified their protests in prison. They wanted to publicise their cases as much as possible, and so Campbell went on a hunger strike, saying at one point he only consumed black tea for over 90 days. Steele went for a different approach, deciding to escape from prison several times and making high-profile demonstrations. On one occasion, he even escaped and made his way all the way down to London, where he attached himself to the railings at Buckingham Palace. He said that every time he knew he'd just be sent back to prison, but his goal wasn't ever to escape for good. He just wanted to bring awareness to his case, get his name in the paper, and hopefully attract the attention of someone who could help. And it worked, because eventually the case was referred back to the appeal court once again. Campbell and Steele were even granted freedom pending the outcome of this appeal, allowed to go back home to their families for a little bit. Only of course this was to be short-lived when this appeal also failed. The three judges couldn't make a unanimous decision on whether this new evidence relating to Love's testimony that he'd lied would have affected the outcome of the trial. Which is crazy to me because the entire first trial hung on the word of Love's testimony. Without that, they probably wouldn't have been able to be convicted. That's obvious to me looking at it now, but the judges couldn't see that back in 1998 apparently. So Campbell and Steele were taken back to prison. But of course they weren't about to give up and the legal battle continued. It was only in the year 2000, with the creation of the new Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission, was there any advancement. The commission requested all the material on this case from the Crown Office and even went to court to get further paperwork including government correspondence. The Crown Office was not happy about releasing any of this, but in the end it was ruled that they had no choice, they had to. The Commission's job was to carry out a full independent review, and to do so they needed all of the relevant paperwork, so the Crown Office had to give it all over. It would be years until this appeal was heard though by the appeals court, but this time it actually succeeded. The Commission argued against all three of the main pieces of evidence in this case, sharing problems with it all, problems which I've already been sharing throughout this video, so I won't bother rehashing it all here. The main argument of this appeal was that there was a conspiracy amongst the police to get Campbell and Steele done for murders, whether they'd actually committed them or not. The eyes of the entire UK were on them, and they had to show that they had done something. The police had done something. Online, you can actually find the court documents pertaining to this appeal, and I'll leave them linked down below in case anyone fancies having a read of it all. It details every single point of it. At the end of it all, Campbell and Steele were actually freed in 2004, 20 years after they were convicted. Campbell would say to the press when he walked out of court, "There's no jubilation, there's no happiness, because there's only losers in this case. The Doyle family have lost a family, we have lost our lives in prison, and for 20 years justice has been lost." The original trial judge, who was long retired by this point, actually spoke out publicly against this ruling of the appeal, saying that he couldn't believe there was any police collusion in this case. But this guy actually said at the original trial to the jury that to believe that Campbell and Steele were innocent was to believe that a large number of detectives had deliberately built up a false case against the accused, which was unthinkable to him. His comments aged pretty badly, I think. Campbell's solicitor would say that the term used to describe this case will be a miscarriage of justice, but it was more than that. It was a malicious prosecution by the Strathclyde police. At the heart of this case were allegations of police corruption, officers of the law who conspired for nearly 20 years to keep these men behind bars. But it's important to remember that Campbell and Steele weren't the only victims in this case. Should they have spent 20 years behind bars for this crime? That's for you to decide. But they were definitely at least involved in the ice cream wars that plagued Glasgow and led to the murders of the Doyle family, who were the real and original victims of all of this. There's no happy ending here. When Campbell and Steele were released, the police never bothered to reopen the case, so it just kind of went cold. There were several leads at the time of the original arrest that just went cold because the police were so zeroed in on the theory of Campbell and Steele. One youth in the area reportedly got a petrol can filled at a nearby petrol station just an hour before the fire, and a witness claimed that she saw a group of boys running away from a crashed car with an empty petrol container just a few hours after. In 2010, gangland enforcer Gary Moore reportedly made a deathbed confession, saying that he'd been the one responsible. But then a couple of years later, his widow actually said that he'd been covering for his cousin, Gordon Ness. Then Joe Steele said that he actually knew who had been the one to light the match this whole time, but he'd never tell. But who's he loyal enough to that he'd spend 20 years in prison for? But he did claim that the crime lord Tam McGraw, which was a name known to all police at the time, was the one who was calling the shots, that he's the one who ordered the hit. It seems that a lot of people actually think that Tam McGraw was responsible. He died in 2007 at the age of 55 after he had to run to Spain to avoid capture. A lot of people suspected that McGraw was actually a police informant, which is why he got away with so many crimes. The police may have known that he was the one responsible, but couldn't convict him because of this, because he was an informant. McGraw's nickname was actually the licensee, reportedly because he had a license from the police to commit whatever crimes he wanted. The police knew they couldn't convict McGraw for the fire, so just had to use Campbell and Steele as full men. Many of the officers involved in the original case are now dead, and some of them even committed suicide. It's unlikely we'll ever get any solid answers here. Like gang ties, police ties also run deep. People who knew of any conspiracy, if there was one, are likely to never tell. Thomas Campbell also died aged just 66 in 2019. He only had 15 years free after 20 years incarcerated. This is just a sad, sad story all around. There are still plenty of people who believe that Campbell and Steele were guilty of these crimes, that they should never have been released. In terms of my own opinion, I'm not 100% convinced they were innocent. They were both self-confessed criminals. I think they may have been involved, but I do not think that there was ever enough evidence to actually convict them, and I'm sure that the police did work hard to ensure that they would be convicted. Whether they completely fabricated evidence or just expanded on what they did have. I mean, this is the basis of our entire criminal justice system, innocent until proven guilty. I don't think they were ever able to prove that these two were guilty, and I don't think on what they did have, they should have gone to prison for 20 years. They may have done it, but I don't think they had enough evidence. And if they did do it, or whoever did do it, I have no doubt they were working on the instruction of somebody even higher up, somebody who was more protected. I think there's so much more to it. I don't think this was two guys just acting alone on this. But I am very intrigued to see what all of you think about this one down below. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting discussion here. Do you think they're guilty or innocent? Do you think somebody else was responsible? Why do you think the police were so insistent to get these ones to go down? Why did Granger and Love lie? Did they lie? Who knows? Thank you so much for watching this video. Please make sure you check out Magellan TV in the top line of description box down below. I am a huge fan of Magellan. I love working with them and I love all the documentaries. Also, just a quick note to end this on, if anybody's even still watching this far in, I took note of what you all said about the clock in the background of the last video. I've kind of just gone for my regular screensaver in this one, but I'm not convinced. I'm just still working on it all. This like space I have to work in my new place is so different from the space I had to work in my old place, so I'm still sort of figuring it all out. I'm so clueless when it comes to technology, like I just don't understand any of it. But I have ordered a new lens because my problem is my lens is so close to my face and I don't have enough space to like put it away. Anyway, I'm rambling now. So yes, I've got a new lens coming. I've also been looking into getting a new microphone. A lot of people have been saying the sort of audio is really funny. I thought I kind of fixed it. I've got a kind of a shield behind my microphone now, which I thought made it a lot better, but people are still complaining about it. I can't actually tell any difference, so I think it sounds fine, but I am deaf pretty much in this ear, so I don't know, I'm just going to trust you guys when you say it's a bit tinny. But don't you guys worry, I am working on improving all of this. It's just a work in progress, so please just bear with me over the coming months whilst I spend all my money. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.